Welcome, everybody. This is the live chat for SCM210. My name is Dr. Charlie Cape. I'm the usual instructor in SCM210. We have with us, and you see on your screen there, Alex Madeira. He is the president of Asymmetrical Consulting. They specialize in KPIs, so I thought it'd be a good idea for the master class to hear from someone who's actually at the point of the spear and in the business. So there's Alex. He and I have prepared a PowerPoint that I am going to start up with us. And so Alex, if you could, I'm going to take this on regular mode and go ahead and tell us about this particular supply chain and your experiences.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Charlie. I'm just getting this screen out on the screen. Yeah, perfect, yeah. So thank you and thanks for the opportunity for this. So we have actually today two supply chain sets of KPIs. The first part is really looking at the global supply chain segment. So looking at one lane out of maybe 300 or 400 that a lot of big companies will have on their global supply chain networks. This one's particularly looking at Taiwan to Shanghai. And then we look at discuss what kind of KPIs are in relation to this. And then later on, we'll have one that relates to a significant size warehouse. And look at some KPIs that are appropriate for that situation. So looking at a global supply chain segment, one particular lane, and then we're looking at a warehouse later on. And then at the end, we'll have an actual example looking at picking one KPI and just seeing the value of that and how it all links together. So this the first slide here is really just looking at one leg in the supply chain. And here we're looking at we're using as an example, these aren't real numbers, this is taking Apple example and show the kinds of scale of their operation. Apple have a big factory in Shanghai run by Hon Hai, and they get all their semiconductors out of Taiwan from TSMC. So what we're looking at here is a supply chain where for that lane, Apple have asked for 300 million CPUs to be made and then sent 1 million a day to Shanghai from Taiwan. And so that's just one leg of their supply chain, looking at one international flight leg there. You'd also on that same lane, you'd have AU Optronics and Foxconn for some of the subboards that would go into some of the electronics there.
Alex, just a moment. Amanda, this is a different one. If you could look in your emails, it explains you're not supposed to attend this one. You're to attend the normal one in an hour. So you can sign off now, come back in an hour, and that'll be our regular Zoom class. This is for a different purpose. Okay, Amanda? Go ahead, Alex.
Cool. She's just texting. Yeah, so on this one we have various pickups or deliveries coming from the factories in Taiwan, all being taken to the Taipei logistics office and then sent to Taipei airport, which will then go on a plane to Shanghai. And at the other end, they'll go through another logistics operation. They'll go through customs clearance, either by the operation itself or they'll go through a separate customs broker. And then delivery will be sent to the Hon Hai factory itself. And normally there'll be multiple deliveries a day of those CPUs as they come through and as they're required to be in the factory. In terms of the flow, about 10% of the costs occur at origin. 80% is really the freight component, getting it from A to B between countries. The customs will vary depending on the goods that you're moving, depending on the amount of tax that's required to be captured on those. And then at the end, the delivery side will be about another 10% as well. So this is just giving you an idea on the next slide when we're talking about KPIs. This is really the thought we're having. It could be by air, could be by sea, could be by truck, but there's a lot of these KPIs are very, very similar for that supply chain.
What I'd like to emphasize here is there's 3 flows, not just the product flow with the freight and everything that Alex is describing, but there's also an information flow, keenly important at this time, and a financial flow. So what you see there, all 3 of those flows at the same time. Justin? This is not the Zoom you're supposed to attend. This is a recording. If you look in the email, it's explained. Our is at top of the hour is our regular Zoom class, Justin. So you can sign off and come back in 45 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So again, those three flows, and the supply chains always move in both directions with it. So you get sometimes the chips are wrong, sometimes the wrong amount of the shipment. There's financial issues, and information often not thought of as part of a supply chain is really the mother's milk of a supply chain, and it's a key component that can't be overlooked. So back to you, Alex.
Sure, and I would agree with that. The information flow, I think these days is as critical as getting the shipment there and paying for it. If you are not able to provide information to your clients, then you may as well not ship it, because they need to know when it's going to arrive and how it's going to arrive. So yeah, very, very, very important. So yeah, so this is looking at transportation leg, international leg. And so, Joe, if you want to switch to the next slide. So what kind of things are we talking about when we're talking about KPIs? We have you'll hear a lot of terminology. You have KPIs, you've got stats, metrics, data points, measures, indexes or indices. And people tend to use these interchangeably. But really what we try and do when we practice in our analytics, what we try and do is break these down into really three groups. So the first group there is statistics, and you may hear words like measures or data points, but really what they are just core statistics. So you're looking at counts and quantities of something in the process. So looking at our global supply chain segment, the counts that would be appropriate for that kind of international transportation would be shipment counts, the number of tons, actual weight versus chargeable weight. You may not be familiar with that, but there are different ways of measuring something depending on its size, its volume. Another statistic would be the revenue you get from those, the direct cost, of moving something from A to B, including the fuel, as well as the actual service itself. You may have an account of the number of employees that are working. You may have something called employee FTEs, which are full-time equivalents. So that's saying if someone does 12 hours in a day, well, we'll call that 1.5, because really someone should really be working 8 hours. So an FTE would count as 1.5 rather than 1. And then at the end here, you've got gross margin. So these are all quantities. They're really scalar numbers. And what they do, they're not telling you anything other than how many you did of something. So these are not what we would call these statistics, and we would not refer to them as KPIs.
And I'd like to emphasize this. What Alex is giving you here is really the vocabulary you should be using. KPIs is going to be kind of a generic term for a lot of things, but it's really their componentry to the KPI that you should keep in mind. So as you apply it to a restaurant or a different business, of course, the statistics change, but this flow that he'll take you through here is really important to keep your eye on. Alex?
Yeah, and you'll find that statistics are not hard to come by. Most businesses that have some kind of computer system will have a lot of statistics. It could be 50, 100. So there's a plethora of information here for to be used. Should we go to the next one? The next slide. So then let's try and be a bit more specific. We understand what statistics are. They're straightforward counts or quantities. But what is a metric? You may have heard of metrics or an index or indices. What we say that this has a particular meaning, which is it is one statistic divided by another statistic. So it's something per something, right? So that's very, very, now you're starting to come into more nearly towards a KPI. Metrics are very powerful. You'll come across financial metrics when you're looking at measuring a business in terms of its financial performance, but you'll also come across operationally useful statistics as well. In this case, looking for the global supply chain segment, you're looking at the average weight per shipment, or you're looking at revenue per kilo or cost per kilo. International business is done in using international units. That's why you're seeing kilos rather than pounds or tons. But this would work for any measure. You also then have gross margin per shipment or revenue per employee. So those kind of terminology, something per something, is really what we consider to be a metric or an index or an indices.
For example, if you're running a restaurant, this could be revenue per employee, yep. Plates. Knew a gentleman that ran a restaurant. Plates served per hour. It could be different metrics or ratios, indexes that Alex has listed here, and they'll vary depending on which sector you're serving out. You know, students per class, for example, those kind of things like that.
Yeah.
But again, they're the second step, and we're not to the KPI yet, but the key second step to it. So you ready?
Yeah, and these are very, very useful, much more useful than a statistic. So what you have here is basically, you know, you're seeing if the trend is going up, or you're seeing if the trend's going down, revenue per kilo or cost per kilo, average weight per shipment. What you don't know from a metric is really whether if it goes up, is it a good thing or a bad thing, right? And so you need some extra piece of information to understand whether you're doing well or you're doing badly. And you also need some context around that. So metrics are very, very useful. They tell you what's going on. They give you a lot of information. They're very, very powerful, but they're not really what we would call a true KPI. For that, you need some kind of additional number. So yeah, Charlie, you want to hit the button again? Yeah. So a key performance indicator, or KPI, it is a metric, but it also has a target. So that target will tell you, you know, average ratio. If it's over 300 kilos per shipment, then you're doing well. If it goes below that, then you're starting to get into unprofitable territory. Or gross margin per shipment. If you can't make $100 on an international shipment, then you're starting not to cover your costs. So these kind of gross margins per shipment, gross margin per kilo, fuel surcharge if you are a trucker or an airline or an ocean, the cost of fuel has a huge impact on your overall profitability. So they're very, very keen to make sure that once it goes over $50 a barrel, that there is some kind of fuel surcharge in there to cover the cost of fuel, and that can go up and down over time. One of their key KPIs is to make sure that fuel surcharge is passed on, so that the additional cost of fuel is passed on to the customer directly. So these things are very, very important. When it comes to gross margin per kilo, a target of 30 cents a kilo, it tells you whether you're doing good or bad. It's not just giving you a metric telling you the trend, but it's also telling you, I've got to get over 30 cents a kilo, or I've got to get a shipment weight above 300 kilos. Otherwise, regardless of what else is happening, I'm not likely to make a profit on some of these things. Now, KPI has a target, and it has a sign, whether it's positive or negative. Sometimes you want to go lower than the target, sometimes you want to go higher. And we have an example at the end that shows you that. But the key thing here is that KPIs have a couple of qualities. One is that you don't have very many. One, you need somewhere between 3 and 7. Below 3, you're not going to have enough to be able to describe the complexity of what you're doing. Above 7, you've got too many and people can't see the wood for the trees.
And allow me to emphasize 2 issues here. One is establishing the target, a key part of a manager's role. This is, my grandmother used to say, what does good look like? No matter what enterprise you're in with it. How many meals did you serve that day? How many boxes did you move that hour? What's the average weight of those boxes? Those kind of things. The other thing to emphasize is that KPIs can become a data overload. That is, you have too many of them. There was actually a study done at Dr. Herrera, and he concluded that 3 to 7, around 7, that's a good number. He actually did a study, and if he gave people lists of things more than 7 or 8, humans automatically shrink those down to, they would combine things together with that. So 2 things that are important here and the key role of the manager. One is, what's the target? What does good look like? What's the average weight per shipment? How much money am I going to make for every kilogram shipped? As Alex has noted here. Am I billing out my fuel surcharge? The other is, you notice that list, you have about 4 items, 5 items. Don't have 30, don't have 70. It's too much to keep track of. 2 key roles. What does good look like? What's the target? And the second key role is 5 to 7. You can have 8. It's an imperfect number, but you don't want to have too many, and you don't want to have too few. It gets to be silly. So I just want to emphasize those 2 points, Alex. And
no, I think that's very important, and I totally agree. So typically, you'd have. Oh, do you want to sneak back? You could have many tens of statistics. 50 to 100. You could even, you'll have a lot of that data. You may have 20 or 30 metrics that go around, but your KPIs are really, you only want to be focused on 3 to 7. And when we say focused on, for any particular business, from the beginning, from the lowest level in the business, the person actually operating, all the way up to the location, to the region, to the product, all the way up to the top of the organization, it's the same KPIs. Right? You're trying to keep consistency within the organization. So your KPIs have to work at multiple levels, at a departmental level, location level, regional level, and a global level. And really well-built KPIs or well-designed KPIs will work and give you just as much information for all 3 of those, for all those levels. Okay, I'm good, John. So that's really just giving you a definition of what KPIs are. If we look at the top right of the screen here, we're now going to look at a warehouse. So warehouse, you have, for people that haven't been to a functional warehouse before, you have significant amount of stuff coming in big quantities. So if you imagine a warehouse that has, say electronics, you've got trucks turning up with containers full of TVs coming from Asia. They're arriving in boxes, in quantities of 1,000 or 100, hundreds of those. And then the warehouse will take those, they'll break them down, store them in smaller chunks and store them in the locations. And then they will be going out maybe 5 or 10 at a time. So you may have TVs, you may have, stereos, you may have computers, you may have phones, etc., all coming in massive quantities into a warehouse. And then they'll take those, make them into small amounts, and then one person will make an order that has, say, 10 TVs, 7 phones, sort of iPads, whatever, and they're all going to come out as a diverse package going out, being picked and taken out. So for a warehouse like that, what we're trying to say is, well, what kind of KPIs would we need to check to see how we're doing on there? You can go very, very, very deep if you want to, or you can keep it simple. What we're going to try and do is just see if we were going to try and understand what was going on in the warehouse. If I look on that top right here, you got gross margin of 20% last quarter, and you have a gross margin of 16.7% this quarter. So your margins are declining, but your revenues are growing, your expenses are growing faster, and you're getting margin decline. But what's going on in that business? So how can we figure out what's happening? So really looking at gross margin variance, and that's a factor of, on the side there, revenues, and on the left there, revenues, and on the right, expenses. Charlie, do you want to hit the next button, next page?
okay.
You want to click the next one? It's not showing up different on my side.
It shows here.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, good. It's highlighting that. So what we'll do is on the left here, we got we're highlighting the revenue. So really, there's not too many factors when it comes to revenue. We're looking at number of orders, orders in and orders out is really what you're paying for. The complexity of those orders, how many lines on average per order are you shipping out from that location, from that warehouse? And then really what you're looking at is revenue per order. So those 3 metrics, if you have revenue per order lines per order, and order count, it tells you your basic scale. It's telling you how complex are the orders going out. Are they increasing in complexity, or are they becoming simpler? And at the end, how much revenue per order are you getting? So your revenue is actually fairly straightforward to track from a warehouse point of view. There aren't that many variables. Let's try. We've got someone popping in.
We have a student. Stephen, this isn't the regular Zoom class. Our regular Zoom is at the top of the hour. Okay, this is a special session, so you can sign off here. Okay, Stephen?
Okay.
And come back.
All right. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
So on the revenue side, we've been through that. Now let's look at the other side of gross margin, the expense side. And from that, in a reasonably well-run warehouse, you're looking at something like an Amazon or someone that does a lot of warehousing. On the expense side, you really have three focuses you want to look at. You want to look at the operational efficiency. How efficient are you in that warehouse? You want to look at the operational rates per hour that you're doing, your expenses per hour. And then lastly, you want to look at your utilization. And the utilization is really giving you an idea of how much of your people's time are being used up doing productive work. And so I should take it from the right. I'll do it from the right here. So looking at utilization in more detail, you can take that one KPI there, the utilization percent, and you can actually then break that down into three components. If it looks like you're trending badly on utilization, then you drill down one layer deeper and actually understand what's going on in a bit more detail. So here, what you're looking at to understand utilization is employee hours worked versus the employee hours time doing non-work. All right, so what's the difference between those? You may work 9 hours in that warehouse. You may get paid for 9 hours there. But you're not constantly working all the time. Sometimes you just go to the toilet. Sometimes there are breaks in the morning and breaks in the afternoon. There'll be a lunch break. Sometimes you're doing meetings. Sometimes you're being trained. So there's lots of things that are counted as work. You're getting paid for them, but you're not actually doing productive work in terms of being able to do picks or do putaways or receive inbound stuff into a warehouse. So that utilization figure in the best run locations, you're looking at a utilization figure of about 85% of your time is actually doing productive work. Most organizations, if you don't have systems that track utilization, people are doing something like 65% utilization. So just by putting in systems that can measure that, your utilization normally goes up to about 70.
Let me emphasize this point because, some people say people only working 85% of the time. You'll need to train them. You may have meetings to set policy. You may be wanting to explain what your KPIs are so that your employees understand what's going on and how they're being measured. That is telling them what good looks like. So another key thing a manager does is what's this administrative, non-work, non-productive time that you have and employees have it, and you need to be pragmatic about how much that is. There's no good or bad number there. It's just what is necessary for your particular business.
Exactly.
So, Alex.
And depending on how complex it is, you may need more training or maybe safety. If you're in a warehouse that's running chemicals or doing live tissue or something like that, then you may find that there's a certain amount of training around safety that occurs and has to be kept up to date, and certificates need to be maintained. So there's a lot around utilization that has. Every company will have its own level that it needs to get to. But it's very, very rare to have productive time that is above 85%. Utilization figure. If you're looking compared to this quarter versus last quarter, and you're trying to figure out what's causing my margin decline, if your utilization figure is staying at 80%, then you know it's not the utilization that's causing your issues, causing your margin issues. So I'm going to switch to the next one, which is the operational expense rate. So let's assume that utilization is right. So there's a number of things that occur on the operational expense. Again, you're looking at the number of people, the number of hours that you have. Again, you're looking at hours worked, but you're trying to figure out, have we worked more hours this month than we did previous month? The revenue went up 20%, so presumably there was 20% more activity. Your expenses have gone up 25%, so it looks like that you got something on the expense side that's causing that, and that could be really three factors. The first factor would be, did we simply work more hours? So that's quite that's quite you know, a first order of magnitude. If you're working 20% more time, yes, you're going to have 20% more expenses. But companies can't just switch on 20% mix for people automatically. They have to acquire those people, and they'll do that in two different ways. They'll either hire people directly, or they will bring in temporary labor to fill the peak. So that employee hours worked is important. But the other factor you can do is you can take your existing employees and employ them on overtime. And that will cost you more money, but it's sometimes cheaper to do that than it is to hire an extra person. So overtime is quite important. You've got when it comes to KPIs, it's typically one of those KPIs that have an upper and a lower bound. If you have too much overtime, let's say over 7% overtime, you're frequently much better off just hiring additional people. Equally, if you have too little overtime, if your overtime is below, say, 3%, then what that's going to do is tell you that you're not managing your resources effectively. You know, it means that you probably could get away with having less permanent staff if you're consistently not using that overtime, and you'd be better off having one person less and using overtime than you would be having an extra person. So that's overtime is a key factor in it. Yes, there's overtime and there's double time if it's weekends or holidays or whatever. But having that at 0 is a problem. Having that at 10 is a problem. Got someone else joining there. Yeah.
I'll talk to Keith here in a second.
Yeah.
Keith, this is a recording for a Zoom, for a master Zoom class. For the regular SCM210, you log on at the top of the hour. Okay, Keith? This is a different thing. So you should log off now and come back in about 25 minutes. Okay, thanks a lot. Go ahead, Alex.
Cool. So other than using overtime, you could also bring temp labor in. So temp labor is great. You need 5 extra people because you've got a peak going on 1 or 2 particular days, but you don't need someone for the whole week, or you don't need someone for the whole month. So you'd bring in temp labor for that situation. Temp labor is good. It tends to be a little bit more expensive than a regular employee. But also temporary labor is also working at about 60% of the efficiency of an internal person. So you bring that temp labor in, you may have to bring in 3 people instead of 2 employees because you're operating at people that don't know the processes, don't know how to be safe, don't know how to be productive in that environment. So temp labor is good. You need that for certain things. If you know you have a peak around Christmas, and then you may want to bring in, Apple actually does this, which is they bring in temp labor 6 weeks before they need them. There's the ramping time of a temporary person is about 6 weeks. They can be at full productivity when the peaks do hit, you know, the Christmas peaks for electronics and stuff like that hit. So yeah, that's kind of important. The expense rate is important there, and that's probably what's gone on and led to that decrease of gross margin there. And then the last one then is operational efficiency. How do you measure operational efficiency? What you're trying to figure out is, I've got my resources, I've got the amount of activity that I'm meant to get. Did I handle what was handed to me in an efficient way, right? So this relies on something called a standard versus actual. You may not have come across that before, and it has many different names. But really, on an inbound side and an outbound side, inbound is you've got big trucks turning up full of uniform products coming in. Outbound, you have smaller shipments of diverse products going out. So when a truck comes in, you can actually look at that truck, you know how much is on it. You can go in and say, typically it takes 45 minutes to unload a truck. And so knowing how many trucks you've got a day, you can figure out how many people you're going to need based on the amount of trucks that you've got coming in, the amount of orders coming in, and the size and load of those trucks. Similarly for picking, if you know you've got this many orders going today and they all have to be done by 4 o'clock to be sent on by UPS or FedEx or whoever, you know how long it takes to pick something, you know how complex the orders are, you know, how many orders you've got. That tells you how many people you're going to need. And that's actually quite a science. You would think it would not be particularly accurate, but if you have 3, 6, 12 months of data, you can be very precise down to, I've got this many orders, I know exactly how many people I need to take it. And because of the law of averages, those tend to be pretty accurate. So what you can do is you can say, I know what I've got coming in today, how many trucks, I know what I've got going out, I know how many orders I've got to deliver. That tells me I need, you know, 90 people today. And then you can say, well, I need 90 people. Let's say you go and get 90 people, and let's say you don't hit your targets because of a big number of temps or some new people, you weren't as efficient as you thought you were, and you needed more than the people that you needed, or you needed more time. So you can break that all down into how many minutes do I need and how many hours do I need of people, and then you can come up with a standard number of hours based on historical performance, and you compare that to your actual, and you can say I'm operating at 95% or 100%. And if last month I was at 100% standard versus actual, and this month I'm at 100% standard versus actual, then I know it's not that I'm being less efficient and my management are doing a good job. It's just related to the operational expense rate that's causing this expense difference.
And reflection of those, you may want to move the standard versus actual.
Yes.
Your shipments could be, you could actually be overachieving it. It's always good with the KPI to understand that it needs to be tuned over time, both up and sometimes down, admittedly, because the mix of your business has moved. In a restaurant, for example, the dinner menu may take longer to serve than the lunch menu.
Correct.
As an example, you have a different standard versus actual with it. And Alex, go ahead.
I think that's what I was going to say. I mean, equally, I mean, in the case of where they hire temps in advance, you would expect an efficiency decrease while they're on the learning curve, and then by the time the peak season occurs, then you then increase your operational efficiency expectations based on that. All right, so let's move on to the next one. Yeah, so that's really how you would analyze what's going on in a warehouse, this applies again. Tiny warehouse with 3 people in it, all the way up to a mega Amazon warehouse that could have hundreds of people.
And these are things, if I'm sorry to interrupt, I saw YouTube on Amazon. They monitor at their warehouses, which I think are the state of the art.
They are.
They monitor these extremely carefully.
Yeah.
It is. They built them from the ground up, thinking this way. I used to think Walmart was great at this, but frankly, Amazon is spectacular at this.
Yeah, they're by far ahead of everyone else. Yeah.
You want to go on, Alex? Or?
Next slide, yes, please. Yeah, that'd be great. And time check, I think we've got, what, 10 minutes or so? Is that?
Yeah, about 10 minutes.
Cool. We'll definitely make this in terms of time. So as I said before, so we looked at a global supply chain segment, and we looked at the KPIs that relate to that, just in terms of KPI definitions. And then we went through a high-level example of what a warehouse would do. And look at some of the KPIs that are relevant to warehouses. I thought I'd go back to the first example, the global supply chain leg. And if you remember, one of those metrics was margin per kilo, and we said anything, 30 cents or more is going to be productive. Do you want to go back one? Go on. Back, one step.
Let me get out of here.
Just reverse back. Perfect. You got it. So what you got here is just looking at one, and so this is really saying, well, if we need between 3 and 7, but what is the power of 1, and why are they useful? And if you get them right, what kind of KPI, what would it look like, and how does it manifest itself as being useful? So here we want to say they're domain independent and they're informative. So KPIs aren't going to tell you everything. What they're going to tell you is where to look for something. It's like a traffic light. It's like something blinking red that says, look at this over here and deep dive into this, because this is anomalous, or you're not on target here. So we have here an example of these aren't real numbers, but this is just a situation I come across many times in many companies. You have a geographical layout. You could have a product layout, but in this case, we're looking at geographical. And the top one there, so you can see North America, looking at this quarter, last quarter versus this quarter. And let's say they performed really well. The management team there in North America, they grew their shipments by 10%, their kilos grew accordingly, that was also by 10%, their revenue grew 10%, their expenses grew 10%, the margin grew 10%. So they're doing great. They're scaling their business with perfectly, right? And so the margin per kilo, which in this case is a KPI, and that we were looking at on the global supply chain side, is showing that there's no variance, right? So you're not blinking red, you're not blinking yellow, that there's some caution here. You're showing that it's really flat, and you're doing a good job. You're scaling your business, so that team's doing great. And then you look at EMEA, they're also doing the same thing. They're growing their business in a scalable way, and they've grown 7%. And again, the KPIs are going to show that scalar growth with showing no variance. And then lastly, you've got Asia there, which are growing fantastically fast. So you're seeing that they're growing everything at 30%. And again, for argument's sake, let's say they're doing a great job. So for each of those three management teams, they would all get their bonuses because they're showing linear growth. They're performing well. They're holding their costs in check. They're maintaining their margins, and the margin per kilos are showing nothing to be concerned about.
Let me explain an acronym here real quick to some people. EMEA is Europe, Middle East, Africa.
Thank you.
We used it all the time, but that's just what that acronym means. Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, good spot it. I normally remember to do that. So here, each of the management teams in each region are doing a great job, and the KPIs are proving, in this case, that they're doing a good job, right? So what happens when you look at those three regions together as a global entity, as a global company? Does the global CEO, is that person also doing a good job? Let's have a look at that. So here you're looking at the global view, and what you're seeing is that even though the shipments and the kilos and revenue expenses, all of them have gone up, your KPI is showing now in red. You got a negative 4.9 variance on your margin per kilos, and that's despite every single team executing extremely well, almost perfectly, right? So each team is doing great, each region is doing good, and each regional management is doing a great job. But when you add it all together at a global level, this KPI is showing that you've got a problem. Look at this area, and here you're seeing that despite the fact that everyone's growing brilliantly and no one's dropping their margin per kilo, as a whole, we are dropping the margin per kilos here. So there's something going on, and you need to explain. And KPIs aren't really there to provide all the explanation. They're there to blink and to say, look, we've got something to look at. Go and investigate this. I should go back one, Charlie, if you don't mind. So in this case, what's happening is that something's causing that. And if you may not be obvious looking at the numbers, but what you're seeing here is the fact that Asia are growing super fast, but their margins are relatively low compared to America and compared to EMEA. So the margin per kilo in North America is 30, in EMEA it's 50, but in Asia it's 13.5. So if your lowest margin per kilo country is growing faster than your other countries, then you're going to have a deleterious effect on the overall performance of that company. So that's really where you're seeing the margin per kilo there dropping, is because Asia are growing that much faster, and therefore they're dragging down the overall margins. Now that may be deliberate. They may have a deliberate strategy to do that, and you would then expect that. But that's where these KPIs are designed to tell you, give you blinking, flashing lights to say something's happening, go and investigate. And then you would decide whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. So if you flick to the next one now, Charlie. Let's see what would happen if we, instead of growing Asia by 30%, let's say we kept everything else the same, but we reduced Asia's growth by 10%. And you can see on the right there, for the Asia column, you're dropping everything by 10%. Again, the margin per kilo is not blinking. You're scaling your business down. But at the bottom here, you've got an overall impact of margin per kilo going up. So your lower margin locations has dropped and that had the impact of raising the overall margins per kilo on the entire enterprise at a global level. And
Let
so
me emphasize something Alex said just a moment ago. I'm going to raise to it.
Yeah.
If you start to offer a new service, go into a new geography, open a new store, whatever it is, you may find that it's okay. Your margins aren't going to quite be there in the beginning.
Yep.
With it. So as he's trying to note here, it doesn't mean it's necessarily a bad thing, but it could be, but you need to be aware of where you're at versus the other regions, the other stores, so on and so forth. So for example, retail do same store sales as a key KPI, and it's, and startup stores have different margin pictures than established stores. And this could be a situation here with Asia. Potentially, it could also be you have the wrong kind of freight too, but it's potential you're trying to get started. It doesn't tell you what to do. It shows you a light.
Yep.
You're the manager. You got to figure out, was this by intent or something that needs your a change in strategy? Go ahead, Alex.
Right. Yeah, and so what you're seeing here is that this KPI, this margin per kilo, that works for one person on one lane, all the way up to an office that does many lanes. It does goes all the way for a region, a country, all the way up to a continent or a global view. Same KPI, and this KPI is very reliable when it comes to global supply chain. It's telling you whether you got margin issues or not. And again, one of the key things here is that it needs to inform you, and it needs to be domain independent. It needs to be able to work at multiple levels of the organization for it to be really a true KPI. Now the question is the best KPIs, and this really tells you the KPIs need to be linked to your strategy. Right? So if your strategy is to be the fastest growing, lowest cost provider, then a growth of 30% growth and a 5% decline in margins for you is a good thing, right? So that is your strategy. That's what you're aiming for. Asia executing better than the other ones, if that's what your strategy is. The KPI is the same, but when the KPI goes negative, you're expecting that because that's your business model. You're trying to drive down cost. You're trying to drive down revenues in that particular market, revenues per kilo. And you think that you can reduce your costs faster than your competitors, and you want to take business off them. Equally, on the right-hand side, your cost could be that you want to be the highest quality provider. It may not be the lowest cost, but you provide the best quality service, the best information. And as we said before, and people like Apple and those guys, they value the information just as much as the product getting delivered, and as does Amazon and some of these other guys. So their case, in their strategy, they may want to say, we're not interested in the lowest margins. We want to make sure we're profitable because we need that to invest in our systems and our processes to make sure we have the best.
And let me emphasize there, go back to something noted earlier. The hard part of KPIs is, what does good look like?
Yep.
And really being introspective and self-aware and ask yourself that question. You could be winding down a region. You could be winding down a product line, a store, and you're going to have a different expectation for the KPI while that period is going on, both in the startup and in the takedown, both. But I do want to respect everybody's time, Alex.
I'm good. Yeah, that was it.
Good. I'd like to thank those who are going to look at this thing. This masterclass is a new thing for us. I'd like to thank Alex especially with it, and glad you could do it. And the key thing with Alex to note is this is his business, but you got to make. Not everybody can afford those ridiculous rates that Alex charges for his business. You're going to have to build your own KPIs with it, and you need this kind of perspective to do it correctly. With that, I thank everybody. I thank you, Alex, and
thanks, Tony.
I'll catch you all later. Thanks again.
Cheers.